Good morning, everybody. This morning I am sharing what I am planting in my Ohio garden in the second half of May into the very beginning of June. Now, I was trying to share these as shorts, but there is so much planting going on right now that I couldn't squeeze it all into a 60-second segment, hence the longer video today. For reference, my last estimated spring frost date is right around May 10th, but I don't plant any of my warm season crops out until at least May 15th, and the biggest bulk of them get planted right around Memorial Day weekend. While it may not freeze here, the nights in May can still get pretty chilly. And while most vegetables can tolerate dips into the 40s, it doesn't make my heat-loving crops super happy. Plus, some heat lovers are particularly sensitive to soil temperature. So waiting a little bit later allows me to ensure that that soil is really nice and warm. Now, yesterday was a big planting day for me. I was trying to get in as much as possible before the rain got here, and it's a good thing we did because we got dumped on last night and this morning. But I kicked off my planting with tomatoes. I start my tomatoes from seed indoors around the 1st of April, typically upgrading them into larger pots about a month later. This ensures that they have really nice, big, robust root systems by the time they're ready for transplant. I also always try to bury my tomatoes deep because this allows them to put on additional roots all along that buried portion of stem. I'm planting my indeterminate varieties along my cattle panel trellises, and with my determinants, they always get a heavy-duty tomato cage. I've tried flimsier setups without good results, so I just stick to these cages that I know work really well. Now, for additional tomato transplanting tips, be sure to check out the video linked above, where I share my top 7 tips for transplanting tomatoes. Next on the transplant list are tomatillos, and I plant these much in the same way that I do tomatoes. I'm also always sure to give these guys cages for support because typically the varieties that I like to grow, which include Tomoyo, Superverde, and Siqueiros, can get quite big. Now, some tomatillos are happy sprawling on the ground, but I find that getting my plants up off the ground is much better for their overall health and keeping them clean from pests and diseases. Next up are peppers and eggplants. Now, these crops are a little less vigorous than tomatoes, so I start them indoors a little earlier, usually about mid-March. Like my tomatoes, I like to grow these guys in cages. Once in a while, if I'm growing a smaller pepper variety, I can get away with just staking it, but I definitely like to give them some kind of support, and I try to get it in place as soon as I set my transplants. Now, you'll notice when transplanting all of these crops that I kind of follow the same method. Each planting hole gets a dose of all-natural fertilizer. I'm using the Gardens Alive brand, but in general, I just look for plant food with naturally derived sources of nutrition. So think alfalfa meal, manure, blood, bone, feather, or kelp meal, and humic acids. And to crops that benefit from it, I also like to add mycorrhizae to the planting hole at transplant time. I plant, I water, and then I mulch. I try to have grass clippings or leaf mulch on hand so that as soon as I'm done planting, I can put the mulch in place. This keeps the soil from drying out and suppresses weeds, and as a bonus, can add some nitrogen back into the soil. Now, I found that while rabbits generally leave my tomato transplants alone, they will nibble on peppers and eggplants. So at my parents', where we don't have any fencing, I've started using this little trick. Once I've got my cage in place, I wrap it in lightweight insect fabric and secure it in clamps. Now, clothespins would work well for this also. Just make sure to use the lightweight stuff and not the heavyweight frost cover because you'll fry up your plants on a warm day. This keeps hungry bunnies off the plants and, as an added bonus, breaks some of the wind we get here from beating up the young plants. Next up are my cucurbit crops, so things like winter and summer squash, zucchini, all types of melons, gourds, pumpkins, and cucumbers. For the most part, I do transplants of these. So I start them from seed indoors the first of the month so that they're ready to plant out towards the end of the month. I like doing this because it gives me a little bit of a jump start on the growing season, but in my growing region, my season is long enough that I can also direct sow them without problem. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that if you have problems with cucumber beetles, you might consider doing transplants versus direct sowing. The reason for this is that tender, newly emerged seedlings are most susceptible to cucumber beetle feeding damage versus a transplant that is properly hardened off and very healthy. The other suggestion is to delay the planting of cucurbit crops to avoid cucumber beetle infestations. The idea here being that as cucumber beetles arrive in your area, they're going to feed off of the available crops and then move on their way to find new food sources. If your cucumbers or melons aren't out at the time that they're in your area, hopefully they'll just move on and then you can put your transplants out. Now, I've not properly done experimentation with this method to figure if it truly works, but I figure it's probably worth a shot. Now, I also net my cucurbit crops when possible. This has quite a few benefits, the biggest one being that it keeps some of those pests off of my plants, at least long enough to where they can get a really nice, healthy, established start to life. Now, additionally, in the case of my summer squash and zucchini planting that I'm doing here, I didn't actually take the time to harden these off fully. They were only outside for, I think, about 3 or 4 days prior to planting. So this netting tunnel will actually allow me to plant, but still kind of continue on that protected hardening off process. It'll protect them from harsh sun and wind, as well as insects. Keep in mind, though, that unless you are growing a parthenocarpic variety that does not need pollination to set fruit, you're going to want to take any netting that you use off of the plants once they start to set male and female flowers. Otherwise, you will not end up with a crop. Next up are sweet potatoes. Now, these are true heat lovers. So sometimes I wait till early June to plant out my slips. I want the air and soil temperatures to be really nice and warm for these guys. Now, I did plant this little area out early. For some reason, the company sent me these slips super early. They do hold pretty well if you just put them in a jar of water, but these had been sitting so long that I really felt like I needed to get them planted out. So I put them out, it got pretty chilly. They're not super happy, as you can see, but I expect that once we get into these really warm temperatures that are coming next week, they'll pop right out of it. Now, my plan was actually to put hardware cloth in the bottom of this bed that I have these planted in to deter some of the vole feeding. Too many projects, too little time. Needless to say, it did not get done, so it's on the to-do list for either late this season or next year. In the meantime, I've got these vole bait stations placed around the area, and I'm using a warfarin-based bait for voles. Now, it's not my top choice. I don't really like to poison anything unless I don't have an alternative, but I don't know if I can bear another heartbreaking sweet potato harvest like I had last fall. So I'm opting for this particular bait poison because it has very low chances of secondary poisoning or illness in any animal that might eat those poisoned voles. Now, I'm not doing peanuts this year because I still actually have a lot left from my harvest last year, but if I were planting peanuts, it would be planting time very, very soon. I typically start these indoors in early to mid-April and transplant them out around the end of May, beginning of June. Now, again, these are a heat lover, and peanuts really don't like being transplanted out until that soil temperature is at least 65 degrees Fahrenheit. And of course, I am planting out all the warm season flowering annuals. zinnias, marigolds, sunflowers, morning glories, more nasturtiums, cleome, cosmos, castor beans, nicotiana. I'm sure that I am missing something in there. But for the most part, I always put out a healthy mix of flowers around my vegetable plantings. Now, I've had quite a few people ask about my flowers, wondering if I'm using them as companion plantings or to repel garden pests. The answer in short is no. I'm primarily planting them for the pollinators and to draw in beneficial insects, and of course because they just look lovely, but I don't necessarily subscribe to companion planting per se. I think a lot of the evidence for the benefits of companion planting are anecdotal at best. I think if it works for you, that's awesome, and I've said it before, I am all in favor of crop confusion and breaking up your plantings with mixed species. But I'll give you an example. A common one that I often hear is, well, if you have problems with tomato hornworms or tobacco hornworms, just plant marigolds all around the base of your tomato plants or pepper plants. I have done this. My garden is full of marigolds every year. I plant marigolds and basil and all kinds of things around my tomatoes. I still have hornworms every single year. Now, a little side note related to that, I recently had someone recommend a book called Plant Partners, which is supposed to be a scientifically backed, well-researched book on companion planting that actually works. And I haven't had the time I'd like to delve into it deeply, but this is something that I cannot wait to do some experimentation with in my own garden. So if I find any really awesome tidbits from that, I will be sure to let you know. Now, basil, of all my warm season crops, this is probably the one I have to be most careful with planting later in the season. So while it may not die, once we get into the temperatures in the 40s, basil will start to show signs of cold damage. So with this herb, I like to wait until my nighttime temperatures are regularly above 50 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, I started these basil from seed on April 20th, and I just moved these out to the greenhouse yesterday to start the hardening off process. So after about a week, week and a half, these will be ready to transplant out into the garden. And of course, what is summer without corn? I'm typically planting corn of all types in this time frame. I was really hoping to get my corn in yesterday before this rain hit. I did not get it done, so it's probably gonna be next week sometime. Now, while my growing season is actually long enough that I could plant short season sweet corn varieties up until the beginning of July, I just don't have great luck with that. Maybe if I had irrigation to all of them, but when I've tried to plant that late, the plants end up stunted, my production's not great. So I really focus on trying to get corn in before about the second week of June here. Now you can see back here, this is one of the areas that I've got corn going into this year. I had winter rye planted in this area. I just chopped and dropped this about a week ago, and I'm gonna go in with some sweet corn next. Beans of all types are also being sown. So that's bush green beans, pole beans, runner beans, lima beans, shell beans, you name it. And like corn, I direct sow these. Now, both corn and beans you could transplant. I just don't find that it's worth the effort here. They're very, very easy to grow from direct sowing. And really one of the only compelling reasons I can see for transplanting them is if you have a very, very short season area where you're trying to get a jump on that growing season. But here it's just not necessary. Now, bush snap beans in particular really lend themselves to succession sowing. So while most of my beans are going in right in this kind of end of May time frame, with bush snap beans, I'm doing new sowings every couple of weeks all the way up until the beginning of August. And this gives me a continual supply all season long. Now, bush beans, of course, will keep producing as long as you keep the plants picked, but I find that they do, after 3 or 4 pickings, just kind of tend to peter out. So I like having a fresh new planting started. Now note that I have a mid-October fall frost date, so that's where I get that kind of last planting around August 1st from. If you've got a later planting date, you could go even later into the season with green bean sowings. Now with my beans, like all legumes, I like to use an inoculant. The inoculant that I'm using contains a nitrogen-fixing bacteria, Rhizobium leguminosarum. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong. I'll put the spelling up on the screen. But the claim is that this helps promote a stronger root system and thereby bigger harvest. What this bacteria does is create a symbiotic relationship with the legumes. So it actually helps the legume to form nitrogen-fixing nodules on their roots. Now here in my soil, I noticed that even without the use of an inoculant, my legumes do form these nodules. They do seem to have a lot more when I remember to use the inoculant. I have not done a side-by-side comparison looking at plant health or yields using with or without this inoculant, so that's something that I'd like to try in the future. And if anyone has tried that, I would love to hear from you, because this inoculant is one of these products that I always hear recommended, but I've not really seen any just home gardeners trying a plot with and a plot without and really seeing if they're getting a difference in results. Now I can see where if in your soil you don't have this particular bacteria present, the inoculant would be very, very important. But it seems that here in mine, it is naturally present. And finally, okra, another heat lover. I can plant this crop anytime from the end of May through the beginning of July here. And with okra, I've done both direct sowing and transplants, and they both end up about the same. So I really don't see much return on my effort from doing transplants. This year, I'm just direct sowing all of it. Now, if you like the taste, okra is a really great option for growing in Ohio and similar areas. It tolerates clay soil, it tolerates heat, humidity, drought once it's established. I don't have many problems with pests or diseases. Now, the Japanese beetles will eat the foliage, but okra is also tolerant to defoliation to some extent. So it's a really easy to grow, unproblematic vegetable crop. I also have a theory that it helps break up clay soil, because if you've ever uprooted an okra plant at maturity, you see what kind of huge extensive root systems these plants have. It's pretty impressive. I've got a lot more work to do, so I am going to get to it. But I would love to hear from you guys. What are you planting in your gardens right now? And if you enjoyed today's video, please consider subscribing to my channel, Growfully with Jenna. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.